Well, here we are on chapter 4. So, we're going to be looking at the organization and regulation of our body systems. In the last unit, we were looking at cell structure, trying to understand how we could build a body from the cell up. And now we're going to start building things like tissues, organs, and organ systems. We'll look at the 4 main tissue types, how they look, what their function is and where they're found. And then we'll take a step back and look a little bit at homeostasis and how that's maintained in the body. In this first section, we're going to be talking about tissues. And a tissue is simply a collection of cells of the same type that perform a common function. And the entire body can be broken down into 4 basic tissue types: connective, muscular, nervous, and epithelial. So we'll be taking each of these tissues individually and trying to understand what makes them different from each other. The first category is connective tissue. This functions to bind and support the body. The key thing about these cells is that they're separated from each other by a matrix. Now, this matrix can be made of a lot of different things, but it's usually protein fibers, and typically it ranges from anywhere to a solid, like you would find in bone, to a rubbery material, all the way to a fluid. Again, the key thing about connective tissue is the cells do not sit next to each other. They're separated by this matrix. Connective tissues can be broken down into 3 key categories: fibrous, where the fibers are either loosely or densely packed together; supportive; or fluid. Now, fibrous connective tissue typically contains a fibroblast, which is the cell itself, and then a matrix that's made of collagen and elastic fibers. It tends to be kind of rubbery. It can be used for supporting the epithelium, your internal organs, so it can be found in things like your arteries, your bladder, and your lungs. Your fat tissue goes into this category, but so do your tendons and ligaments in that dense fibrous connective tissue, where they're a little bit more organized and that rubbery substance is a little firmer. Here are some examples of that. Again, if you look up in here, you can see these individual cells that are separated by these fibers that are making up the matrix. Here you can see a little bit better image of this. Now remember, in this fibrous connective tissue, we're looking at things like the adipose tissue here and the ligament here. Supportive connective tissue comes in 2 different categories: cartilage and bone. This tends to be a lot harder. So if you feel your nose, the tip of your nose tends to be cartilage, the outer shell of your ear is cartilage, and then the solid bone. This matrix in cartilage is really solid, but it tends to be a little bit flexible, and bone is very solid and rigid in its matrix. They both have these chambers for the cells that are called lacuna. Here you can see this a little bit better. Here are the individual cells, and then you can see that they are separated from each other in these little lacuna, and then the matrix is a lot more organized, a lot more solid. This one's cartilage. In bone, it gets even firmer. Fluid connective tissue consists of blood and lymph. Blood has a fluid matrix that we refer to as a plasma. So if you've ever gone to donate blood, one of your options is just to donate the plasma. Inside this plasma, we have formed elements like your blood cells and your platelets, white blood cells, red blood cells, and then the clotting factors. Your lymph is found in the lymphatic system, and this fluid gets its name from what it is lymph, and it's primarily white blood cells in this fluid, and you'll find them congregating in places like your lymph nodes. Here you can see that those cells are completely separated from each other. This is the bloodstream. You can see those little formed elements of platelets, red blood cells, and white blood cells, all separated by this fluid matrix here. So remember, we have 3 different types of connective tissue: fibrous, supportive, and fluid. Our next category is muscle tissue. This is where movement in the body occurs. Cells with very organized protein fibers, actin and myosin specifically. And this movement, these types of muscle cells can be categorized into 3 different categories: skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. A skeletal muscle is what you're using under conscious control. These are the muscle groups that you work out with. This is what's allowing you to write right now. Typically, it's attached to the bone and it's used for voluntary movement. Keep remembering this. You can think about this and actually intentionally move it. The fibers are so well organized under the microscope, you can see them almost as striations. They're so densely packed that the cell body itself is almost invisible, and you can see these little nuclei here. And then the cell itself, you almost can't tell where one stops and one begins. Smooth muscle tissue is very similar to skeletal. The cells are a little bit more separated, but again, they're still very distinctly next to each other. You can see these nuclei. They line things like organs and vessels. And although those muscle fibers are really well organized, they're not quite well organized enough to be able to see the striations like you would see in skeletal muscle. This is responsible for voluntary movement. This is why when your intestines start cramping and you're getting diarrhea, you can't go, golly, I think I'll wait and do this later. Skeletal muscles, you have conscious control. Smooth muscle, you do not have conscious control. Your cardiac tissue is even more organized, but they tend to be very short cells. Again, you can still see this striation in here, but they also have what are called these intercalcated discs, which allow for rapid communication so that we can time and coordinate that movement. It is an involuntary movement. In fact, if you take cells out of a heart and put them in a petri dish with enough nutrients, creepily, they will keep beating. Again, this is a very specific cell only found in the heart muscle itself. The third category of tissue is nervous tissue. It's used for communication between your cells, sensory input, integration of data, and motor output. There are only two types of cells that we find in the nervous tissue. The neuron itself is what's the workhorse of the nervous system. It has a cell body, it has dendrites that receive signals, and it has axons that allow those signals to carry out. The other type of tissue or other type of cell is the neuroglia. And they come in some different forms, but these are what are supporting and nourishing the cells. You can see here's a little astrocyte right here, and oligodendrocyte, which is a mouthful, the microglia, and you don't have to know these individual names. Just know that they outnumber the neurons 9-1, and their function is to support and nourish those long pieces of the neurons. The last category of tissue is your epithelial tissue. This lines your body cavities, covers the surfaces of your body. It's found in your glands. Typically, there's a basement membrane, and it's completely free on the other side. They come in layers. If you just have a single layer of epithelial cells, we tend to call it simple. If there's multiple layers, we call it stratified. And then sometimes they look a little bit like they have layers, but they're not. And so then we just call it pseudostratified. They come in some different shapes. Cuboidals look like cubes, so you can see these are a cuboidal. Columnar look like columns, and squamous looks like you squashed them. They're flattened. Here you're seeing a pseudostratified columnar. See how it almost looks like there's layers, but there's not really. And so that's a pseudostratified columnar. The one back here is a simple cuboidal layer. So if we look at these, you can see they're found in all sorts of different places in the body. Here you've got squamous cells lining the lungs, very, very thin layer allowing gas transport. Here you can see the kidneys have this simple cuboidal cells right here. You can see pseudostratified cells where they're columnar, lining your respiratory tract. They come, like I say, they come in 3 different shapes and 3 different types of layering. So, in summary, we have 4 different tissue types. Connective, where the cells are separated from each other, either solid, rubbery, or liquid. You have muscular tissue, where you can see the cells are so closely together, they've almost blended into one another. Our nervous tissue, which is that very branched tissue specialized in communication, and then your epithelial tissue where the cells touch each other and they're working more for covering the body. And that summarizes part 1 for this chapter.